Thank you very much, Luke. This is Phil Stevenson. I'm one of the ODA product managers, and welcome everyone to our June edition of On the Air with ODA. I'm joined today with my colleagues, Carlos Ortiz. Good morning, Carlos.
Hey, good morning, Phil.
And Paul Sane, who will be monitoring and proctoring the questions and so on. So we're really pleased that you're here with us today. We're going to be talking about, I think, a favorite topic, and that's patching. And we're living proof, Paul and Carlos and I, that even product managers can do patching. So just a reminder that if we mention dates or anything, you saw the safe harbor statement, and we don't commit to dates for product or feature. What we're going to go through today is we're going to talk about, just in generic terms, ODA patch release strategy, and then preparation for patching, which we think is a key ingredient to successful patching. Now, we may seem like we're putting things a little bit out of order, but we're going to go through a patching example from 19.6 to 19.7. We found it to be simple and fast, and we wanted to do that so that you could get a full sense of the full steps and all the steps that are involved with patching. Now, we know that a lot of you are upgrading from 18.8 to 19.6. Now, upgrade has a little additional steps, and we're going to go through those additional steps for the 18.8 to 19.6 with some tips and so on, because it involved an operating system Linux upgrade from Linux 6 to Linux 7. And then we'll entertain questions and answers at the bitter end. So don't be bashful. You can ask a question on audio, or you can submit the question via chat. Okay. Now, this is an admonishment that we typically make. I think we know that customers will typically want to stay behind maybe at least one patch, one bundle patch set. They don't want to be early adopters always. And we understand that. But our recommendation as a best practice would be never get behind 4 releases. And that's important, because it often happens that you'll need to reach a certain plateau or a certain release to be able to get to a future release. And that means that you'll have multiple patch steps. We won't always be able to go from 18.3 directly to 19.6. There are interim steps in between. And the further behind you are, the more complicated that gets to be. The other aspect of this, I think a lot of you out there have customers that are plagued with auditors for security. The security auditors will always insist that the latest CVEs and critical patch updates for Oracle Database are on the system. And the further you're behind in terms of ODA software release, the less likely you are to comply with their audits for most recent updates for critical patches and CVEs. So keep that in mind. You can't expect to be past all of those stringent security audits if you're way behind release-wise. So just want to point out that in order to patch to 19.7, you must be on at least 19.5 or 19.6. And let's look at this in a little more detail, Carlos.
Sure.
Now, this is a map, and I think we wanted to show the path from 18.8 because a lot of people wanted to have support for the 19C Oracle database. That had become an important priority. Now, we had introduced and announced support at Open World back in October 2019, but we also said that we would make available versions of the ODA software that would allow testing of 19C. So one of those releases was 19.5, and we provided 19C database support. That was the only database support. We supported it on all models of the ODA, but that was for testing purposes. But some people couldn't wait. They had compelling reasons to run 19C production, and so we accommodated that and gave them an upgrade path to 19.7 so that they'd be on a regular maintenance cadence. The typical path to 19C would have been to upgrade from 12.x or 18.x releases to 19.6. And then, of course, we announced 19.7 merely a week ago or so. Now, our first iteration of upgrade from Oracle Linux 6 to 7 in 19.6 release, we didn't support an Oak CLI stack for a virtual machine platform. And we did do that in 19.7. I'm sorry, we'll do that in 19.8. And that's why you see the blue path below. So the people that are running OVM can upgrade from 18X all the way to 19.8, and they'll have support for the virtual platform. So I hope that kind of clarifies things, because there was some confusion around that. And that's sort of what we're seeing today. And I think a lot of you are probably in the process of moving from 18.8 to 19.6, and then maybe some of you are already moving from 19.6 to 19.7. We make a distinction between upgrades and patching, and we'll point that along the way. Okay, let's get into it. So Carlos, I think the thing that we want to emphasize here is that we want people to do a lot of preparation before they go in at dark 100 on Saturday morning or whenever they have scheduled time to take the production machine. You want to take advantage of that time and not be distracted. So we'll emphasize heavily the Oracle development, the Oracle Database Appliance development team since release 18.3 have been enhancing Oracle and creating features that improve the patching process. And we want you to take full advantage of a lot of those. And those relate to PreChecks, they relate to PreCheck, the full integration of PreCheck with Oracle support and Oracle ODA development, so that known issues get to be part of PreCheck. The beauty of the PreChecks and the PreCheck is that we can identify potential issues before we're in there actually early in the morning, and we can make corrections when we have access to other resources, first shift and that sort of thing. So yes, we want to go as deep as we can to identify things, right, Carlos?
Definitely. And the key here, right, the key here is that we want customers, right, to do the steps a few days before they're going to do the patching, right? It is depending on how much time they have. It could be 2, 3, 5 days. Because if they find any issues, we want them to have time to implement the fixes or talk to technical support if they need to, right, to just prepare. So one thing that Phil mentioned, and I want you to keep in mind, is that the example that we're going to give you is from 19.6 to 19.7 first, right? So you're going to see some references to 19.6 and 19.7 as we go through this. And we distill this preparing for patching to 8 steps that you see here. For some of these steps, we have additional information. Some of the other ones are just very easy to understand. No need to give you more slides. So we're going to quickly go through this one, right? The first one is always read the release notes. In this case, the 19.7 release notes documentation for known issues. Okay, and we're going to give you an example of that.
That's really important, Carlos. You're absolutely right. And I know there's a tendency to like, oh yeah, everybody says look at release notes. But I think that's probably especially critical because if you understand, I mean, our ODA developers, they have to juggle not just ODA's piece of the software, but the rest of the company's software, RAC, Oracle Database, Oracle Linux, and so on.
And so, hardware patches.
And hardware patches.
Absolutely.
We maintain a converged system. So, you know, there are things that happen that we discover. We can't test for every infinite number of environments. So release notes, that's a very key distinction.
Yes. And so the second step is, right, you need to download and update the repository. I'm going to show you on this next slide, right, for the download and update, a screenshot of the release notes. In number 1, you see just one example of one of the files, and you see on the second column that it says patch number. That's a hot link. You click on it, it'll take you to the page where you can download the file. right? Number two is the screenshot in the buoy, right? Where you would enter the server, the patch files to update the repository, okay? You're gonna see through the slides that at the bottom of the slide, we're gonna give you the CLI instructions as well, right? Most customers like the CLI. Some of other ones like the easiness of the browser user interface, right? So you have a choice here. And now, as we go through the files, or as you go through the files in the release notes and you go check the size, you're gonna find out that these files are huge, right? Or big. For 19.7, it was over 30 gigabytes, right? When you download the server patches and then the database clones. So the easiest thing is for customers to just check if they have enough space on their system drive, and if they are careful at managing the files, fine, they can use that, right? But we have a suggestion that we put on the left-hand side. You can see that suggestion box, right? You can create a temporary ACS volume file system and then dump all the files in that volume, right? Which is going to reside in the data disk group. And that way you don't take any of your system drive space and you don't run into any issues. This is one suggestion that we have. We put all the instructions in the Appendix C, right? You can refer to that on your own time.
Yeah, that's a good point, Carlos. So this is an option, and not every customer is going to need to do this. We know that some customers have a lot of Oracle databases, so they have a lot of Oracle homes, and they might be pushing capacity on their system drive. So this is just a tip that help you avoid any kind of out of space situation. Yes. We'll talk about that a little more later.
So yeah, step number 3, right? Download and install the AHF, the Autonomous Health Framework, as PreCheck, and the OraBR. Now, we want you to do this because we always want you to be at the latest version on PreCheck. It has new checks that our development team implements to make sure that the system is optimal for the patching process. Okay, OraBR, it'll just take a snapshot of the system that in case something happens, you want to restore to the previous state, you can do that. Okay.
And I'd point out also that there are blog entries for both of these topics in the ODA blog, Oracle blogs. The TFA changed with Oracle Database Appliance at release 18.8. So it's now included, and updating is quick and fast, and integrated with PreCheck. Now ODA-BR will save you a lot of time if for some reason patching should go unexpectedly. It'll allow you to restore your system to its previous production state a lot faster than, say, a reimage or something like that. And there's also, like I said, a blog entry for ODA-BR, as well as a My Oracle support note.
Mm-hmm. And the next step, right, is to run the PreCheck. Remember here, right, it's remember that up to this point, you've only downloaded and updated the repository. You haven't updated any of the components yet. So when you run the PreCheck here, and I'm going to show it to you on this slide. Right here is in the buoy. You can see that number 1 at the bottom. Right, you run the PreCheck, and in the yellowish oval there, you can see available versions. Right, when you updated the repository, all these new versions are going to show up. Those are the ones that can be updated. You see the component on the left-hand side, right? It's so you run the PreCheck here, but since we haven't updated anything, the checks that are going to be run here are the 19.6 checks. Okay, so we still want, as a best practice, we want customers to run this because they can catch some issues. For example, if you're going to have some drive space issues, not sufficient to do the installation, you better catch it now, right? So you can clean it up before that. So this is the first step, right? Run the PreCheck, and On this next slide, you can see an example of the output on the PreCheck on the buoy. CLI command is at the bottom, so you can get it, but you're gonna get the same information. And what we wanna highlight here, okay, is that if you look at the status on this one, on this report, it says failed. And number one, in PreCheck, you can see the PreCheck fail. Up top, we have OraBR, right, that also failed. The reason is that we didn't install it. That's all it's telling you, that we didn't have it installed when we run this. But the key one that we want you to focus on is PreCheck. If you go to the release notes and you read the known issues, you're gonna see that these are known issues and they do not affect the system functionality at all, right? It is safe to proceed.
That's right, Carlos. And this will be repaired and so on. But this is an example of where you would understand that had you read release notes, and it won't be a surprise. And as you mentioned, it doesn't impact the patching or the integrity of the system in any way.
Correct. So,
and I point out at this point as well, these preparation steps 1 through 8, you know, we're talking about at a time, maybe the week before the weekend you patch, if that's the way it works. So these can be done in the comfort of your own office, first shift, when you have availability to Oracle support, if you need that kind of resource to ask questions, or you're a sales consultant or whoever. So this is the preparation that will help you once you're in there by yourself to avoid as many problems and maximize that time you have when you're doing the actual update.
okay. So the next step is customers should always have database backups, right? If you talk to them, make sure that they have always backup their database. And the next one, number 6, is customers make some modifications to the system. They may have some one-off merge pages, patches, right? Custom RPMs, OS profile customizations, right? They're gonna need to remove them or keep in mind that what they are so they can go back and implement them, right?
That's right, because our patching will replace those with stock profiles and our set of RPMs and so on. So you just, if you're making modifications, you need to be aware of what those are, because you're gonna have to make those again after the update.
Mm-hmm. And number 7, just make sure that the hardware health is okay. You can go to the buoy, and in there you're gonna see green check marks for all the hardware components. If something's not right, fix it before the patching, right? It's for the high availability configuration, you can run this OCLI command storage topology and the if tool command just to make sure that the interconnect with between the heads is okay. Right, it doesn't take long.
And that helps ensure the rolling aspect of the patch. And if for some reason you see some kind of anomaly or not a green light or something, there are ODA ADM CLI commands that will show you a little more detail about the hardware. But usually a cursory look at the buoy, the conditions of the hardware will tell you that things are fine. And you've been running production, and you probably know that. But it's worth a look anyway.
Mm-hmm. And when you're ready to start doing the patching, just disable all the processes or jobs that may interfere, such as backup processes, cron jobs, enterprise manager agents that you may be running. Is a good recommendation to just stop all that.
Well, gosh, Carlos, I guess we're ready to do it. We're
yes.
Coming in at Old Dark 100 on Saturday morning. I got a thermos full of coffee. Let's start patching from 1906 to 1907.
Absolutely. And we have a few steps for that, right? The first one is take a backup of the system with OraBR. Again, right? Should something happen during the process, you want to go back to the previous state of the Ora system, you can do that. You can restore to that snapshot. And as far as the step, you can see here in number 2, right? We're going to update the DCS agent. Right after, we're going to want you to run another PreCheck. And the reason is that the DCS agent is going to install the latest 19.7 checks. So this one takes less than 20 minutes. And it's safer, right? To just make sure that you don't have any other issues with the latest checks that our development team implemented. Then we'll go update the DCS admin and these DCS components. This step can only be done on CLI today, right? Then you update the server components, the storage components, and the database. We have some steps on post-patching verification that we want customers to be aware of. And we put a couple of notes here, right? The first one is on the HS system, the patches only need to be installed on node 0. And the tooling, right? The patching process will ensure that the files patches are propagated to the other node. Okay, and we went through this exercise on a medium model, a single node, and it took us about 2.5 hours. This is not counting the preparation time, right? But obviously the time for the customer will vary depending on the configuration.
Yeah, that's right. We had a small database and only one database. So it'll vary in time, but it certainly compresses the amount of time it would take you if you consider that you're patching the operating system firmware, ODA software, the Oracle database, and all the components that make a converged system. We've reduced that to hours rather than days.
Okay, and the first step is the backup with ODAVR. Phil, can you walk us through this?
Sure. You know, ODAVR is a utility that we provide. It's downloadable from my Oracle support. And the whole point of this is we implement a snapshot backup using Linux LVM, or the Logical Volume Manager. And so this you can install fairly quickly. When you run ODAVR, you have options. You have multiple options, and you have complete documentation in that My Oracle Support note. But the simplest way to do this is to ODAVR backup minus snap, and he's gonna essentially create a backup of all your system volume components from root /UO1/OPT, all the file systems. This gives you a path back should, for some reason, the server patching fail. You can return your software on the system drive back to its production state, and then come back another day to correct the patching. But essentially, this is what we'll do with that single command, ODAVR backup minus snap. Now, there are options to create a second remote copy if you so desire. But we would be comfortable with you updating or restoring your environment from that backup you made of the LVMs locally. And if you did it remotely, we would, and it was just mentioned in the blog as well, we'd admonish you to probably enlist the help of the Oracle support team. So let's look at the next slide. This is sort of what's happening, and this would look like a pretty intense slide, but essentially we're going to test to make sure that you have root privilege when you run ODAVR, and that the ODA configuration is bare metal, because this won't work on the virtual platform. Okay, we'll remove any previous snapshots so that we know there's plenty of space, and we'll create a backup. This is fairly new. We create a backup of the EFI image, which is where the bootloaders live, and we'll create a boot backup as well, and then we'll make a snapshot for all those file systems, OPT, UO1, and root. Now, we'll mention this further down, but I'll just say it now. We'll allocate LVM space for the defaults for those file systems as they would be installed from an ISO image. And that comes to about 190 gig. We won't use 190 gig, but we're only going to capture the Delta modifications to your operating system files in that snapshot so that we can return to the state of that system drive before we did any kind of patching or updating. But we need to have that space available should there be a lot of updating and so on. Now, another aspect of that is that if you have enlarged your UO1 space because you have a lot of database homes, then ODAVR will allow you to specify a different value for space to allocate for the LVM to accommodate the larger UO1 and so on. So we've run this, and now before we move on to the patching part, we want to confirm that we do have valid LVMs that we can restore. So we run the ODABR operator info snap. And info snap will see that we have copy on write sizes that are equal to the file system sizes themselves. And so far we've used very little of that data, right? And those will begin to fill depending on how much patch activity there is for each of the file systems. And you can run info snap at any point in time to understand that you have good LVM backups and so on. Okay.
So the next step is to update the DCS agent, right? It's you see on the yellowish box with the arrows, right? There is a 19.6 and the available version is 19.7. On number 1, you click that update server. Number 2, you see that apply patch. So click on it, and then, right, customers is going to get notification that is updating this DCS agent. And if you look at that number 2, right, that button, the status changes and now reads updating DCS agent, right, as it goes through the process. And once it's completed, right, you're going to see that the installed version is now 19.7 and the available version just calls up to date. And I want to emphasize again that right after this step, you see that second bullet under the screenshot, right? We want the customer to run the PreCheck. Again, it's less than 20 minutes. But this, now after we install the DCS agent, the PreCheck now has the latest checks for 19.7, and it's important, right, that customers run it.
That's right. If you remember previously when we ran PreCheck, we were at 19.6. And we still wanted to do that because part of the PreCheck will run OraCheck. And if you recall, we updated to the latest release of OraCheck when we applied the AHF setup. So this is sort of like just a little bit, it seems a little redundant, but it just will detect something before you commit that server update. If there's something that doesn't seem quite right, well, we should discover it at this point with the 19.7 PreChecks.
Mm-hmm. And the next step is updating the DCS admin and components. And this is the step that I told you that it is only done through CLI. The commands are right here in the yellow boxes. Number 1, you can see it. And the point to keep in mind here is that you can run the Ora CLI describe job on the first one to get a status. If you look at the screenshot and look at the status right here, the third line, it says created, right? So you can get a status with Ora CLI describe job. But on the second one for the components, that's very fast. You can see the status success in that bluish line here. And so if you run Ora CLI describe job for this ID here, you're gonna get an error, right? There is no need to run that because the job already completed, so there is no status to obtain. Keep that in mind, as some customers may get confused on that.
And that'll be corrected in a future release.
Great. Now, after this, we're ready to update the server. Here is on the buoy, right? Click the button that says update server, apply patch. In the yellow boxes, I just wanted to show you here the components that are going to be updated when you click update server, right? Even though there is no need for ILOM BIOS, I put them in the box so you know that those are components that are updated with the server, right? Anyway, and on this next screenshot, right, after it's completed, you can see that those 3 components were are now up to date. Those are the ones that were updated. So it is the server, right? It's the next step is update the storage components. In this 19.6 to 19.7, there weren't any components that needed to be updated in the previous screenshot that I show you. But we wanted to just comment, put a couple of comments here, right? Number 1 is that if a customer has a high availability model, they can select a rolling option that updates the disks in a rolling fashion, so the system remains online always. Okay, the model M and S, those are the single nodes, do not support this option, obviously. It's only for the HA.
And something we should point out is that all the while you can do a rolling option, if you're able to do the update of the storage all at once, it would have less impact on system performance and availability. You will see some degradation in I/O performance, of course, when he's doing rolling storage upgrades and that sort of thing. So probably if you get it done all at once, that would prevent that sort of impact on any kind of service levels and that sort of thing. Just a thought, okay? And probably the preferred way to do it if you're able to do that. But rolling is available, and if that's continuous availability is absolutely a must, then that's an option you have.
Okay. After we're done with the server update, the next step is the database. And here in the GUI, you can see the selection database patch. You select the home that you want to update. In this case, right, is the home 4 for us. And on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side, on number 1, you can see the PreCheck, right? You run it, and you're gonna get a report that is similar to the previous PreChecks that we saw, and you're gonna find the same situation here, right? It runs or a check, and you're gonna see this failure again, which is a known issue, right? As we explained. And so once this is done, verify that everything else is okay, then you're ready to just do the database home update. And on the upper screenshot, again, that's the home that we want to patch. And then we just, this time on number 1, we just click the apply button. I put in that second screenshot at the bottom just to show you the database that resides in that home. You can see on number 2, the version, right? Is the 19.6 January 2020 for that one. And this will get automatically updated as we update the home, as you can see on this next slide, right? Once it's done, you can see on number 1 for the home that is now a 19.7, and the database at the bottom was automatically updated to 19.7 as well. Okay. And well, that's it, right? That's all the updates that we've done is very straightforward. And as I mentioned, this whole process, it took us about 2.5 hours in a single node. And now, right, once all that is done, we want to do some post-patching verification. So, do you want to walk us through this?
Yeah, so Carlos, this sort of proves one thing. We know that it takes 3 product managers to do a patching. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, we're finished, and we found this to be a relatively simple process, actually. And but documenting it was harder than doing it, and I think you could tell by the detailed PowerPoints, screenshots, and so on that was the biggest chore we had. But you know, after we patch, we want to do some verification to understand that we have a system and we haven't compromised any kind of integrity. We can use the buoy. That's a quick way. And also the ODA CLI commands. We can check the state of the system after patching, that the described components and so on. We can see the version level and the hardware levels in the database and so on. After we are confident that we have a good running system, we can delete all of those ODA VR snapshots and reclaim that system space. And we can use the info snap command from ODA VR to be certain that we did delete those logical volumes that were part of his snapshots. And if you had customizations, and your customer had customizations, it's a good chance, because the ODA development team is doing a really good job of saying at the Oracle Database RU level now, the current RU level, that you won't have one-off patches that you install as a result of out-of-cycle patching for security vulnerabilities. But you know, if indeed you do find that you have a patch that's at a level greater than, in this case, the release of Oracle Database April, a release update level of April, then you need to restore that And the same would be true if you did case splice patching of kernel RPMs for CVEs. And we were surprised to find out, but our good friends in support told us that indeed people do make personal profile changes to the accounts, the Oracle accounts defined in the Linux system. And sometimes those changes for permissions or whatever will impact the patching process. And so we encouraged people that if you're going to do that, we prefer you don't, but those changes are going to be wiped out after the server update. So, and if you're running DataGuard, you want to enable the log shipping again and get the standby site called up and that sort of thing, and, or just to get the standby site to get the production site called up again. And then if you have applications that would normally run at that point in time, you want to validate that they're running correctly and things look good. And I think probably the biggest consideration is any kind of service levels. You want to make sure your response times and batch elapsed times are equal to or better than the previous version of the software that was running on the ODA. And if patching did fail for some reason, you had those system backup with ODAVR, and you could consult the doc for ODAVR, do the restore, and be back at the state you were before you started patching. So that kind of wraps this aspect of it up. We're patched and things are running, Carlos. We're looking good.
Absolutely. So I think, as we said, right, many customers are not on 19.6 yet. So a lot of them are on 18.8. So you have some tips here. Do you want to talk about that, Phil?
Well, yeah, and so the reason we did this out of order is that the upgrade from 18.8 to 19.6 is essentially the steps that we went through from 19.6 to 19.7 with these exceptions. Now, there were some big things happening with this upgrade. We upgraded from Oracle Linux 6 to Oracle Linux 7, okay? So that's, and we do that in development. The ODE development team does that in a way so that you don't have to re-image systems. So in order to do that, there's a lot of development effort to ensure that you have continuous availability of your system. And so a part of that, you know, up to this point, ODAVR has been a best practice and a strongly recommended procedure, but we didn't insist on it. But when you saw Carlos showing you the PreChecks where we were flagging the lack of ODAVR being installed, it's because we really thought it was very critical from the 18.8 to 19.6 to be dead certain that you took backup of your system file systems. So we insisted on having ODAVR installed and that there was sufficient space to take the LVM snapshots and so on. So that's something that happens in 18.8 that you can expect. So if you haven't been using ODAVR, 18.8 to 19.6, you need to consider, and you absolutely would want to have installed ODAVR so that he'll make part of that his installation procedure for upgrading a Linux 6 to Linux 7. And then after the OS upgrade, he's going to have a post check to validate the integrity of the Linux 7 system. And then if there's some issue with the operating system as a result of the 18.8 to 19.6 upgrade, then it's probably a good idea to have at hand some kind of recovery or consultant recovery techniques for any kind of failed operating system upgrade. And that would involve the rescue disk and of course the ODAVR snapshots. But that's documented really well in that section called Recovery from a Failed Operating System. So at any rate, one of the other aspects of this upgrade is that RPMs for third parties, you'll need to reconcile those. And as part of that PreCheck for the OS, the server upgrade of the OS, he'll separate Oracle RPMs in this directory listed down below from third-party RPMs that come from different repositories. So you can sort out your third-party stuff versus what's absolutely essential for the ODA to run. So that's it in terms of differences.
And that's basically is right the overall instructions for the patching. There are some documents that we mentioned throughout the presentation, and we put them in here for you. These are the references, and also the last 3 pages or slides are the appendix, right? Number 1 is how to reclaiming storage space if customers have system space or drive space issues. Here are some suggestions, right? The second appendix is just the user customizations. This is not recommended, but some customers do it anyway, right? It says, so here are some additional instructions to identify, right, those customizations. And the last one is just creating that ACFS volume and file system, right? Should a customer need to do that? Again, this is a suggestion only. And here's a link to just where this presentation is going to be posted, and you can also find previous presentations. So Phil, I don't know if you have anything else to add here, or we can go to Q&A.
Yeah, I think that wraps it up. I think we can open up for questions, and we'll entertain questions. You can just unmute yourself and ask a question, or enter a question in the chat, raise your hand, whatever makes you feel comfortable, and we'll try to answer your questions now. So go right ahead.
Or Paul, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, there was one, but we already answered, just about the path from 18.5 to 19.7.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess one thing I just want to emphasize is I think the big lesson learned is that from our exercise of patching is that the more preparation you do, the actual patching part is actually very straightforward. You know, it's like 2.5 hours we were done, right? Once you've done all the preparation.
Mm-hmm.
They're very simple and fast.
Yes, and as a guidance for our sales guys when they talk to the customers, right? There's a lot of work that have gone into this patching process, and for many customers, right, is one of the reasons why they love the Oracle Database Appliance, right? Straightforward patching, as opposed to just doing it with doing all the different components if they build their own system. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think a lot of times customers take for granted what's involved and how much the dev team has simplified patching, because we're doing a lot, and they've compressed the effort considerably. And if you just to remind yourself, take a look at the database documentation and look at OPatch just for the database, the steps that you would have to cover to do OPatching, and that doesn't include operating system, doesn't include firmware and all the other components. And you'll get some sense of how much we've improved the patching process. Okay, are there one more time? Any questions?
Yeah, Phil. Hey, this is Phil and Carlos. Thanks. This is Tony. I have a question for you.
Yeah, Tony, sure.
Yeah, so yeah, great presentation. It's very thorough. So I definitely think a lot of effort put into that. Had a question on, I think we started this in 18.7 where we do the ODA CLI update, you know, the DCS admin and the DCS components.
Right.
So going forward, is that going to stay the same?
Well, you know, I haven't heard it's going to change, but I don't. That'd be a good question for our development manager, Prasad.
Okay.
But as far as we know, that it'll be like that.
Okay.
Unless it changes, Tony, I guess, right?
Yeah. Because now we're integrating like you know, OraCheck, right? OraCheck now is part of the built into the PreChecks, right? So
yeah, OraCheck's
that's a good thing involved in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The OraCheck, I don't know if a lot of people have appreciation for the OraCheck thing, but that was a great stride forward, because that's a coordination between the Oracle support people and our Oracle development team for ODA. And we're making sure that that's really topical information there in terms of known issues.
Yeah.
Because, and that's why we admonish people to use the latest version of AHF so they get the most current version of OraCheck with the known issues.
Right. Well, I think you make a good point, right? The preparation part is probably the most important thing.
Well, I mean, we just imagined, we were on a system that we experiment with, and so we filled up UL1 with a lot of database homes because we were using GDB clone and the different sort of things, experimenting, and we were just creating a bunch of snapshot databases. And we weren't paying attention because it's not a production system. So it's not, I'm not trying to beg a comparison. However, there are customers that do have a lot of databases. And so
Yeah.
that requires a lot of resource from UO1. So one of the things we determined early on from the PreCheck, and like I said, you can discover that in the luxury of regular business hours, and when you have access to resources to help you resolve issues, is that we had to clean up UO1. We knew what to do. We got rid of those database homes where we weren't using. We also had a space issue with /OPT. And we've got tooling in ODA now, in ODA CLI and in the buoy to remove previous patch sets and that sort of thing from the repository. And so we had to do a bit of that. But that's documented in this presentation and that we covered in the Reclaiming Space appendix. And
Hey, Phil.
yeah.
I got a chat question from Walt. So the question was, does all this apply to ODA virtualized environment? We have a customer on 12213 with 70 plus VMs across 2 ODAs.
Yeah, I don't want to say that this is all, the generic aspect of it is applicable to any environment, in as much as you need to read release notes, do the preparation, that sort of thing. But in terms of a stepwise progression, I would consult the documentation for specific steps for updating the virtualized platform.
Yeah, this commands that you see here are for the bare metal. We wanted to concentrate on bare metal on this one, to refer to the documentation for the virtualized. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else? Well, I'm getting the hook now. So listen, we appreciate your participation and thank you for attending this. We'll be back with you again next month for another installment. And I wish everybody a good weekend and thank you very much. We're signing out now.